Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I put up a notice earlier, and I appreciate all of you who set aside time or who were otherwise able to join me live so that we can discuss a topic that, really you could take in one of at least two ways. Who is from God? When you hear that question, when someone asks you, obviously depending on who asked the question or who you are, it may have a certain religious context, but it could just be in a more abstract sense related to even similar to kind of a religious being, a cosmic being that's not quite known in the sense that I'm thinking. So a non-religiously defined God or other type of force, but that is referred to as God. So what we're going to talk about today, although it does relate directly to the biblical texts involving God and the people who texts speak of as his representatives in one way or another. But I believe it applies beyond just the biblical texts and history accounts of people like Jesus. I think the things you're going to see if you read these accounts with us, and if you don't have a biblical text, then you can listen or follow along. I'll bring up the accounts we're going to read in a moment. But we're going to be reading from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because those are the most reliable texts that we have of detailed accounts involving Jesus of Nazareth, the one Christian witnesses of Jah and others believe is the Messiah, or the one text before Jesus was born speak about in ways that, in our view, most likely apply to him, and do so in ways that we can show, at least reliably from a historical point of view, that he did the types of things that were foretold before he was born. Now, whether or not that's enough to convince you, it may not be. Now, there's other evidence that we believe in, apart from even Jesus as the Messiah, but that brings us to him. And that involves the God Jah, his father in the New Testament text, whom he also calls God, and in quoting various Old Testament texts that use his name, either in Hebrew or Aramaic or in the Greek texts of his day, according to the best available evidence. So he knew him as that God. He came in the name of that God. That's our God. Jehovah, Jah. You can call him Jehovah. Others call him names that aren't as accurate or even accurate at all, like Yahweh. But that's not the subject of this show. For the purpose of this show, they're all the same. We're not going to get into the pronunciation of the name. That's the same God we're talking about. But I use the term God in the title of the show for what we're talking about, because that way, because it is a term used in the biblical text in association with the name, right? The God that we worship is Jehovah. That's his name. But he is God in terms of the description of who we see him as, what he does as the being with that name, right? So this involves his power, his position, his creatorship as God. Other beings are called gods in a way that either reflects his godship, the sons of God, or others, sons of God as well, but who've abandoned their role as those who imitate their father, Jehovah. And so they, like, for example, in our view, Satan and others, rebelled and they do things on their own. And they set themselves up as gods. Okay, so they're not imitating their father the way Jesus was. So in our view, in the New Testament text, when we see Jesus, just like he says, many texts we'll read, but if you want to see on your own, John 7, John 8, John 12, whole chapter, read it and you'll see John 14, many other texts. I'm just giving you 3 or 4, but we'll get into details more in a moment. So when he came, though, he didn't come to set himself up as this separate entity, right? I mean, he's the Son, the sent forth one, but like the angels in the Old Testament, he came to represent God. The angels in the Old Testament are even called God in the direct ultimate sense, and even as Jehovah, using the anglicized form. Again, the way we're talking about, the way we speak of these ancient names today, at least the way I do and others do, based on the best evidence related to his name, best phonetic evidence. And so, how they spoke it, Greek transcriptions, other evidence, how they wrote it. So when it comes to that God, even though that's the name, that's the specific God, we talk about here most often, today really I think is more general in application. I think it's more something that even if you don't know that God, Jehovah, Yahweh, Jah, if you don't know the biblical God, just by reading the biblical text we read today involving that God's Son, his primary sent forth one, that's how he's described and describes himself in the biblical texts. Just by reading the accounts we're going to read in a moment and talking about them, I'm positive, based, depending on how long you've been alive, of course, right? Your experience with people. But for the most part, I think regardless of who you worship or whether you worship God or even believe there's a known God at all, again, whether you just accept that there's some abstract God out there whom really we can't identify with, either way, the people we're going to read about today, I believe you will see, are still in society more or less. Again, depending on your experience and because of the biblical text we'll read next, there's a certain society and religious political element to the people and the events that we're going to be reading about. But I think it transcends all of that for the most part. So really it'll be up to you to tell me what you think when you see or after we read these accounts. Can you relate to what they're talking about? Or does it seem so unrelated to your life that there's no value in reading it at all? So obviously if you worship the same God as I do, you already know there's value, or at least you believe there is. But even if you don't, I think today's texts apply. Okay, we're Christians, we worship Jehovah, Judeo-Christian God, fine. But that aside, it's going to be a part of it, but you can still be involved, right? If you in any way believe there's a God, cosmically or otherwise, spiritually, connected, in a greater sense, connected with the life that's going on, right? The things that have happened before and that continue to happen. If you in any way believe that there is a God or God connected with these things, all right, then today's discussion is going to relate to you in some way, because I think you're going to see one way or the other whether the people we read about are from God, whether you think they're from God, even if you've never had any encounter with anyone like this at all, right? Do you think these people we're reading about are from God if they lived, if they existed according to these accounts? What do you think about them? Obviously you don't know them. We only know them from the written account. So, we still nevertheless can evaluate what is said to have happened and then decide, okay, I think that's probably or probably not from God. Let's think about it at least in those terms. And then, of course, if you're a dedicated believer, right, you've convinced yourself, you've looked at not just the pre-Christian Jesus is the Messiah evidence, but you've gone all the way back, right, to Genesis, like we've done. You've looked at all the text, you've looked at the science, you've looked at the history, and you can see all of these things are actually real, not myth. The things that actually happened and not too long ago, and there's evidence to show it. Well, then, these things are always going to stand out a little bit more to you every single time you go over them, aren't they? Because there's so much going on, and the biblical records are so detailed and well-founded, and they give us a lot to talk about. So let's get right to it. I'm going to bring up the New World Translation, not because I think it's the best translation, although, as I often say, it's not nearly as bad as those of you who don't like the MWT think it is. And I can say that because I've defended it for many years, and I've also been honest where I disagree with it. And while you still may disagree with where I defend it, the fact is it's up to you to bring it up to me or in the chat if you disagree. Right? Otherwise, I'm going to use it because it's convenient, because many topics and issues that we discuss often relate to either the Watchtower NWT or JWs associated with the Watchtower, because some of us were or are. And also the NWT lends itself to many of these discussions because of its controversy, unfortunately, deserved or not. And even though I'm working on a translation of text, which I prefer to use if I've done them, I have not completed them all, and so I'm going to go with the text that I at least know well enough and that I can discuss probably best if I have to. Because I also know the underlying text, I think, well enough to, be able to qualify it where necessary. But I think in large part the NWT can be used. I don't care if you don't like the way it reads, get over it, right? Let's try to get into the meat of the text. By that I mean, well, I can certainly see certain things. I'm not using the newest version either, but either way, it's not so old that we can't get the sense of it. So let's just move forward and deal with it and try to get a good view into the account, not distracted by things that aren't the most important parts of what we're talking about, right? How can we tell? Really, mostly today, right? I mean, we can't really, in our view, we do make decisions, of course, who we think is from God in the past, Jesus, all these people, whether we think they're from God or not, but we didn't meet them, right? Today, we're here, we're now. People meet us, we meet other people. We need to know what happened before our time, right? Because obviously we can learn from that and see where things are going. And then we need to be able to see what's going on in our time and to use them as our guide. That's where they're really, like I talked a little bit about before the show, where they're most important. Because even though we're learning from the text, we need to learn in order to be able to make an application or to do what's next. That's, the learning is one thing, but if the learning is so far outweighs the application, it doesn't usually go right? I mean, the whole point is to be able to do what's right, to see the light and say, okay, that's where I'm going. That's the right direction. I'm not confused, or at least I have enough evidence, right? We don't need to know. Who knows really what is going to happen next? We don't. We have a good idea. We're more often than not right? Because we have a familiarity, a sense of what happens typically each day, each night. But we don't know if we would survive, right? If we went out and drove. No, people die every time. Not everybody, but many times. So why couldn't we be one of those? So we don't know, but we act like we do, right? So we don't have to know. Not even where it concerns our life. But we don't just want to throw our life out needlessly, right? I mean, so when we take it into our hands, for example, by driving, even though there's a chance we could die, there are precautions. There's things we can do, defensive measures, right? Speed, position, places, things. So that we have some control, not total control, but enough to make us feel comfortable. All right, well, at the very least, we should feel like that with other decisions in life. We don't know, but we should have enough control and feel comfortable enough with what we can manage so that we're not going to lose our life, right? We're not going to give it away, or give it to those who would take it, right? That's not a Christian principle, right? Many people may today or otherwise in the past or in the future say they're Christ or Christian, misuse it, but even Jesus said that would be the case. So he warned us, right? We didn't really have to learn the hard way. It's hard sometimes because we have to learn one way or the other at this time. And unfortunately, not everybody presents the same unified view of Jesus or things pertaining to the Christ. So we try to keep it simple, right? 1, 2, 3. Jah, Jesus, you, and me. Well, that seems to be enough and seems to be the right balance of teaching and importance, priority, giving others the control, freedom, what I was just talking about. And in comparison to driving, right? So people are given a large percentage of control so they feel comfortable. They don't have to give up all this authority to us in ways where we're making all these decisions outside of the most important things, really, the three that are in the biblical text, presented as in that order, essentially. So you can watch my video on 3 things or the article I've wrote. But basically, as you know, that Jesus summarized the law by saying that the 2 greatest things are worshiping Jehovah and treating others as yourself. And he came to fulfill Jah's law as the Son who brings everything back to the Father, which makes him number 2 in importance, having been sent by the Father, right? The Father's greater than I, John 14:28. Simple text, right? Spoken by Jesus Christ. Well, we believe that, right? We don't have to add things to it or try to get into his mind. Oh, he was just speaking from one nature. He's got 2, but only one knows, or one's greater. That's not Jesus Christ, okay? Biblical text. Read it. Next. All right, so let's take a look at that, in fact. Matthew chapter 2. And this is what we do, right? We are after the biblical text because that's what we've come to accept as the best historical authority when it pertains specifically to Jesus Christ and Christian activity, but also things connected to it and that are related through the Jewish people, the Hebrews, and all the way back to people like Abraham and others before him. Noah. So we've talked about these in relation to our day text and text readings in Genesis. So I encourage you, if you want more, take a look at those. Or just read the biblical text, right? Matthew chapter 2. Who are from God? Let's see. So with that in mind, let's read with me either here or by listening or in your own text. Let's take a look at Matthew 2, 1 through 7. First, let me just take a look real quickly. All right, looks like everything's good right there. Matthew 2. Really what I want to do with me and you is to look at these texts and ask the question and then answer it, of course. But you have to keep the question in mind. Are these people from God? Right? And of course, we don't want to make a judgmental determination, but in some of these texts, Jesus makes the determination, right? So it's not us. We're just repeating it. If he says it, then if you believe in him, you believe he was correct. But we don't have to say anything beyond that, right? So otherwise, I want you to more reflectively answer these questions, ask and answer the question, and then comment where you feel necessary. But I want you to really to benefit from this lesson, and the way I think I will most is by reading these texts and asking ourselves that question. Are these people from God? Does that sound like they're from God? Right? Maybe the Christians got it wrong. Maybe the people they're writing about, even though they could of course control the narrative if they were not being truthful, right? And then just describe them negatively. But these people were certainly individuals that we're going to be talking about who worship God, right? All of them. Pretty much all of them. Except maybe a few, right? Like Herod. I mean, he did and he didn't, as we'll see. But they're all essentially connected with some type of representation or want to be that they're from God. Matthew chapter 2. Let's take a look. After Jesus had been born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, look, astrologers from eastern parts came to Jerusalem. Verse 2, saying, "Where's the one born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when we were in the east, and we have come to do him obeisance." Now, the word obeisance can be understood in several ways. As you know, if you watched my worship words in the Bible video. If not, I encourage you to do so. Or take a look at some of the writings that I've done related to the Greek words proskuneo and latruo. But the video I did recently is really the one that kind of covers them both the best. Because we go over more text related to latruo. But this is a term that it relates to the Greek verb proskuneo and can involve worship or obeisance, kind of bowing before a king. So these astrologers are coming because their beliefs and astrology allows them to see the coming of the Jewish Messiah, the one born King of the Jews. And they want to honor him, right? This is not whom they worship as their God directly in the same way, certainly, that the Jews did, right? They're not the Jewish people. They're people from the East, Babylon or in other areas, where they follow the stars, things that they can see, patterns and movements that Jehovah set in place, that the Babylonian mystery schools and other religions in the East could see and understand in ways that were consistent with how the Jews understood certain events related to different lunar cycles, different priestly divisions, things that they also recorded to show what would be next. And in one of their texts that we've also talked about in our shows related to our CWJah Talk shows, related to pre-Christian evidence, Jesus is the Messiah, the book of Micah, chapter 5, and that I've also written about in my Watching the Ministry blog. So it's a text that's very important in a Judeo-Christian sense. And so the Jews are coming in because of their astrology. They want to honor the child, the one-born king of the Jews. Verse 3, at hearing this, King Herod was agitated. He got upset, and all Jerusalem along with him. And on gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he began to inquire of them where the Christ was to be born. What are these astrologers talking about? Okay, the astrologers are here, and they're wanting to do certain things. You know, we know these people are weird, or maybe Herod, was more open to them. But either way, they were respected and received and honored from the East in another sense because of their beliefs and their practice. They were devoted in certain ways that were related to various Babylonian views and Eastern views that allowed them to see these things. And so when the Jews were confronted with them in this way, right, they're coming to the Jews. We want to honor your king. This is something strange, right? Not normally the case. So then Herod, who's already nuts, right? He gets even more, crazy, bothered by it, agitated, like the NWT says. So then he goes, and what does he do? He brings the chief priests and the scribes, right? So the main priests and the scribes, the grammatus, the ones who were experts, really, when it came to the law or legal documents, like the biblical texts. You would think of them as really similar to rabbis, and certainly later, after the destruction of the temple in 70, they became more known as the rabbis. And they're somewhat referenced as rabbis also in the biblical text. But they're similar to the scribes, if not the same in that sense. So Herod's getting all the main priests and these scribes or rabbis, the teachers, the experts really of the text of the law, the known experts. And he asked them, okay, so what's going on? Where's this one going to be born? They said to him, verse 5, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is how it has been written through the prophet. Just like I mentioned a moment ago, and you, O Bethlehem of the land of Judah, are by no means the most insignificant city among the governors of Judah, for out of you will come forth a governing one who will shepherd my people Israel. So they're applying this to the Messiah, the King of the Jews, which is how the text is applied by Christians, though written by the Jews, right? But before Jesus was born. We can show that from the text we have, and they're quoting from it here. Verse 7, then Herod secretly summoned the astrologers, right? Secretly summoned them. So he didn't do it in front of the chief priests and the scribes, right? So Herod was smart in that way. He knew to separate them, but to still find out what he wanted after they came to him. So then he finds out what the texts say about where this one would be born from the biblical accounts, because he knows the Jews know these things and would know what they're talking about. And then he gets the astrologers and tells them to carefully, so that he could find from them the time when the star would come. So he knows the location from the biblical text, and then he wanted to know the time when the star would appear. All right, so I don't want to go on too much further with the biblical account involving Herod and the child. I've talked about it in other videos, and certainly when we come back around in our text readings to Matthew, we'll get into this further. But notice again that Herod, crazy King Herod, even though he built a lot of really magnificent things, was nonetheless insane and a terrible person. And his ending reflected that. But, he tried to please everybody in some sense, even though, he tried to please himself most of all. But, once he found out from the astrologers, he went straight to the Jews, right? And who among the Jews? The ones he knew probably would know what they were talking about. The chief priests and the grammatus, the scribes, the experts in the text, the ones who knew the documents. All right, let's go to Matthew 5. So that's one example of the kinds of people that were associated, at least by Herod, right, with these biblical texts involving God, right? This is the one born king of the Jews, connected with the account in Micah, which is written by a prophet of God, right? Micah. And that the Jews viewed in that sense. And so everything related to this involves someone coming from God, right? Or in depending on how you see it, in a representative sense, right? Or being, either coming directly from him if you believe in a cosmic kind of descent, or in a human sense, someone who's representing him, like I said a moment ago, the way certain prophets were viewed. Or these individuals, right? Did not Herod view the chief priests and the grammatus, the scribes or scholars, the learned ones, and the biblical law, not just the the city laws or the area laws, but the biblical, the religious laws, the CWJah laws. Now, as we're going to see, they added all kinds of other things, but when it came to what was their primary authority and what foretold all these things, we're not talking about adding different ways of cleaning yourself. This biblical text written by prophets that speak of something else. Right? Herod knew to call the chief priests and the scholars. He saw them as from God, even if he saw the astrologers also from God, regardless of whether it was the same God, just like we talked about in the opening. All right, let's go to Matthew 5. Take a look at another account. This is great. We'll go through a few. We're not going to read everything, but we're going to kind of just skip through a variety of examples from the 4 great message accounts or gospel accounts, where the scribes, Pharisees, religious people you associate with God, Jesus himself, right? Even astrologers and others, who's from God? Right? Were the astrologers from God? Well, they're certainly coming to do something that is respecting what people like you and me, if you're a Christian, see as from God, right? The King of the Jews. So it's sometimes hard to say, isn't it? Did they just get it right? Were they following the Babylonian mystery school system in ways where they could see through the stars a consistency with how the biblical account spoke of the different priestly divisions and other things that would help define the time of the Messiah's arrival? We can't say for sure, right? Because it seems like when you say, okay, the astrologers seem like maybe they are from God in one sense, that sort of, involves a lot, right? At least from the biblical text, it's simply acknowledging that they were correct in their interpretation of the stars. And so the biblical text does not discount everything having to do with these mystery schools or Babylonian religions and beliefs. Some of them are true, but they're done or achieved in ways that are not correct, or done honoring different gods, not CWJah. They don't show faith in him in the ways that would protect people like you and me and others in these texts. So either way, the astrologers came, understood the stars, or were somehow motivated by God, right, to come and give his son obeisance. It doesn't look like they really cooperated with Herod, if you read the rest of the account, but nonetheless, then you had the chief priests and the scholars of the biblical text. Okay, are they from God? Were they from God in telling Herod? Were they just witnessing to Herod? Well, Herod, the astrologers are probably correct, because in the biblical text, it does talk about the Messiah. And you need to stop doing all these terrible things, Herod. Right? Maybe they were thinking Herod was being, shocked into belief because these astrologers came. And he's like, well, wait a minute, is this true? Hey, you guys tell me, is this correct according to the biblical text? Yes. So, I mean, there's sort of a sense where, at least at this point, right, maybe their witness to Herod is from God in that sense. Certainly the biblical text they're quoted is from God, right? And then the events that happened. But so they're, at least though, they're informing Herod in according to his nefarious plan. And whether they knew all that, we'll leave it at that. But Matthew chapter 5, verses 19 through 20. Let's take a look. Just two. This is Jesus talking. And he says, "Whoever therefore breaks one of these least commandments and teaches mankind to that effect, he will be called least in relation to the kingdom of the heavens." And we're not going to get into all the pretext and context and thought, but you'll see the points I'm getting to, and then we'll talk about the surrounding material enough. Just follow with me before jumping to the pre-material. I'm not necessarily going to involve it. As for anyone who does them and teaches them, right, he's talking about the commandments and the things that are taught. As for anyone who does them and teaches them, this one will be called great in relation to the kingdom of the heavens. Right? So he's giving his disciples, his students, food for thought. He's teaching them about the things related to the law and the prophets. And then look at what he says in verse 20. "For I say to you that if your righteousness does not abound more than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of the heavens." Now, why would he say that? Here, he goes through, obviously, he's having different encounters with the Jews. And again, the accounts we're reading involve specific people, right? And some of them are positive, some of them are negative. Almost all of them are Hebrew or Jewish, including Jesus. So none of this is anti-Jewish or Hebrew. It's part of my faith, at least in the biblical sense. Obviously I don't follow the teachings of post-biblical rabbis if they conflict with the biblical documents. But that's why I go to this. And I'm not speaking about any other Jews or reading about any other Jews than the Jews who were spoken or written about in these texts. Some of whom were written or spoken about positively, and others who weren't. Right? There are other texts where certain grammatus, certain scribes, are shown in a positive light, right? Where they ask Jesus questions about the law and he answers and says, "Teacher, you spoke well." Right? And so there's certain ways where that's not always negative. Right? Even the account with Herod, right? They quoted the biblical text. Who knows what they were thinking about? We know what Herod was thinking about, right? But Jesus, nonetheless, in a pretty much general sense for the ones who were considered scribes and Pharisees at this time, puts them in a negative light, right? The few exceptions aside, maybe Nicodemus, right? We don't know. Certainly some of the things are more positive and certainly not as negative, right, as others. So here he says, if you guys are not better, speaking a little bit more colloquially, commonly, right? If you, my students, aren't better than these other people whom even Herod went to when he wanted information, whom everybody looks to, the scholars, the scribes, the Pharisees, at least here, right? Maybe the Sadducees, they come up later on, other groups, but the Pharisees religiously were really, the main group that encountered Jesus in these texts. And then the scribes, right? Each group had their own scribes or scholars, ones versed in those groups. That's why there's texts even say the scribes of the Pharisees in certain texts. So here, though, it says the scribes and Pharisees. So maybe even some of the Sadducees texts. Who knows? Scribes and Pharisees. Either way, we know that Jesus doesn't like those, right? Or he says, if you don't do more than these, and they're looked up to the most, right? They're, at least for Herod and others, they're considered the go-to source if you want to know about his father. And he says, basically, right, don't go to those. Right? He doesn't say don't go to them really explicitly, but you have to be better than those, or at least your righteousness, that's his words, has to be more than that of those. That's pretty significant, right? So the people whom you might think we're the guiding lights, right? At least the people did, right? Certainly Herod and others, different times. They're running the temple. We'll get to that in a moment. Jesus says, no. You got to be more than those. Matthew 7, 28 through 29. Just two more texts. Now, when Jesus finished these sayings, the effect was that the crowds were astounded by his way of teaching, For he was teaching them as a person having authority, and not as their scribes, not as the ones who were the experts, the most versed in Jah's law. Jesus was teaching the crowds in a way that is described as having authority. Right? It wasn't like it doesn't necessarily say he, spoke eloquently or others, or in other ways spoke about the way he talked. Some texts kind of do. But here, the word authority really has to do with the force of what he's saying, right? Not necessarily the volume, but the impact that it has on the people hearing it. And it's like, when you hear authority, right? Other than certain places right now who maybe wouldn't quite be responsive to the voice of authority in the local or even county sense, city sense. Either way, typically when we hear a voice of authority, right, an officer, a military person, or another person with authority maybe in our company, right, we know it. We know the difference between someone with authority, right? If a judge in a courtroom speaks to you, it's different from whether or not someone in the pews or on the bench in the courtroom speaks to you. Not the judicial bench, I'll say. So we know what that means. So Jesus, according to this account, was talking that way. But the scribes, the ones who knew the most in the view of the people, and probably really did, right? They studied all the time. They had it all around them. They wanted to be known as the scribes. They didn't talk like that. Didn't come out the same way as the way Jesus did. There was a noticeable difference, and yet they had the recognized authority. They just didn't speak like they had the real or right authority. They knew the text, but that wasn't enough. There was something else, right? Because they knew the text. They just didn't have the authority. Not that Jesus had. Matthew 23. Please turn there with me. Let's take a look at verses 1 through 11. Another instance of individuals whom most involved in these accounts either claimed or viewed as people from God, who represented God. Matthew 23, verse 1, Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the seat of Moses. Therefore, all the things they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say, but they do not perform. This is Jesus talking. They bind up heavy loads and they put them upon the shoulders of men, but they themselves are not willing to budge them with their finger. All the works that they do to be viewed, they do to be viewed by men. For they broaden the scripture containing cases or cases that they wear as safeguards, cases that would reflect their religiosity, and enlarge the fringes of their garments. Sometimes the NWT adds, various bracketed words. It's not just other. In the Colossians 1 text, there are words added to try to make it more explicit in terms of what is meant. Whether you believe the brackets are necessary or not, or whether what's in them is correct, we will move on. Talking more about these individuals, they like the most prominent place at evening meals and the front seats in the synagogues. Remember, this is talking about at this time in the Jewish community. Okay, this is not about all Jews, and certainly not about all Jews or Jewish communities today. It's talking about certain people who may be a part of Jewish communities, like I said at the beginning of the show, in the same way that we can see them as part of certain Christian communities, and in other communities of people where they don't believe in anything related to the biblical God, Jewish or Christian. So there's a type of person that at times is a Christian or claims to be Christian, or is at times a Jew, claims to be Jewish, but is not, right? Isn't living in the ways that would reflect a true dedication or an attempt to try to be better according to the sources of authority, right? The texts. Although authority has been changed for many individuals since then. But right now, that's what we're talking about. All right, so he says they like the most prominent place. They like the greetings in the market. They like to be called rabbi. But you're not to be called rabbi. One is your teacher. You are all brothers. No one is to be called your father on earth, for one is your Father, the heavenly one. Neither be called leaders, right? Maybe our father, our human parent, sometimes we just socially, we call him father, but we really mean dad, right? And so, it's talking about more in a religious sense, just like with rabbi. But even with father, right, there are other terms we could use. Neither be called leaders. Plural. None of them. That's a do not do. For your leader is one. And just like we talked about in our Christian Authority show, last text in this account, but the greatest among you must be your minister, right? You want to lead, you want to be number one, be the lowest. Right? When we see that, we'll follow. Okay? John 13. Feel free. You're next. Right? We're trying to do our best to show that we follow and that we're ready to serve. Where we have to, right? We don't all have to wash everyone's feet in the same ways that Jesus did. Although there's nothing wrong with that. We should be prepared to serve our brothers in the exact same way or just like it. Or who really is Christ's brother, right? If you're not willing to do what he's willing to do, then what are we doing? Greatest among you must be your minister. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 2. We'll move through the 4 texts, but we're not going to read the same number of texts in each account, right? I think in John we only have 1 or 2. So, but we have a couple in Mark. Mark chapter 2. Just turn there with me, or you can listen or read along. Let me just take a look for a moment. See how everything is going on. Okay. Well, it looks related to the text, so we'll be happy with that, right? All right, next. Back to Mark 2. Mark 2, 15 through 17. It says, later he happened to be reclining at the table in his house. It's talking about Jesus. And many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many of them, and they began following him. All right, so Jesus is at a table in a house, and there's many sinful people, right? Sinners, it says that. Tax collectors, people who were despised and disliked, and sinners. A lot of them. But the scribes of, remember I said they're sometimes described like that, the scribes of the Pharisees. So specific to the Pharisees here, the scholars, the number ones really, right? Except for maybe the chief priest in certain senses in terms of the role, but in terms of the law, right? Who knew it the best? These are the guys, these are the ones. When they saw that Jesus was sitting with sinners and tax collectors, they began saying to Jesus' students, so they get in, and they're not directly going to Jesus, right? Like Jesus in Matthew 18 says should be done. They go to his students, the weakest ones at this point. And they say, does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? So, obviously trying to get them to doubt him. not believe in him. Upon hearing this, Jesus said to them, "Those who are strong do not need a physician, but those who are ill do. I came to call not righteous people, but sinners." You don't need a doctor. You just said you're well, right? By your comparison with the people I'm meeting with. And you acknowledge them as sinners, people in need of someone in health. And yet you criticize the very thing you would say they need in the illustration about the physician, right? And whether or not it would be the ill one who would need him the most. They would say, yeah, that's true. Well, so what's wrong with that? Why is that not right here? Because they want them coming to them, not to the physician. And then verse 18, the last one in this account. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees practiced fasting. Let's see, is this to our last account here? So we're going to do Mark 2. Okay, so that's enough for that. We're going to jump down to Mark 11. All right, so we can see, let's just recap real quickly on that account. You can see how it says the scribes or the scholars, right? The ones who knew the law the best, probably, and in most of cases did. That's why Herod went to them, others went to them. And that's why they're here, trying to, get involved with Jesus and his disciples. So they see things happening that they don't agree with, and what do? They don't go to the person who's directly involved, and they go to the people who are listening to the one who's directly involved to try to get them to doubt. What they would ultimately agree is the correct thing happening, like Jesus just pointed out. Mark chapter 11. I think I can go a little faster here. Mark 11, 15 through 18. Let's take a look at these texts. All right, we're getting to some more good ones here. Verse 15, now they came to Jerusalem. And we're talking about who is from God, right? All of these people in these accounts, in the biblical text, and as representatives of different types in almost every walk of life and society, now and in the past, right? And probably likely to be in the future to some extent, because we just have a certain division among us that falls into these types more or less, right? Here it's with Jesus Christ and with those who believed in him and with others who do not. But they all claim to believe in the same God. Do they not? All right, so you could take any other religion or any non-religion, but who has the same ultimate objective, ultimate idea of thought, and you will find different people who, I'm positive, more or less are going to be truer or not as true to that ultimate thought or source, and you'll be able to see it by what they do. And the different people involved in what they do or what is done will be able to see it and say, okay, these are these type of ones. This is what they do. And so that's why I said, even if you're not a Christian or a Jew, whether you believe in Jesus or Jehovah, you'll be able to see what we're talking about in relation to our beliefs and the people who are involved with them, things that I think you'll also recognize and therefore hopefully be able to benefit from in terms of our discussion, right? How can you best deal with it and manage situations involving people? It's very difficult, wouldn't it be? And isn't it? Well, we have people who claim to believe the same things in the most important ideas and lines of thought, right? Your religious worship views, our primary views, if you're a religious person, I would say, God. Why can't we all get along, right? Why are we having such a hard time, either in these texts or otherwise, because of people who are similar to the people in these texts, determining for sure or more or less who's from God? Well, maybe we are. Let's take a look further. Mark 11, 15 through 18. Now they came, that's Jesus and his disciples, his students, to Jerusalem. And there he entered the temple and started to throw out those selling and buying in the temple. Right? The temple in Jerusalem, rebuilt by Herod, magnificent, and where essentially the worship of Jehovah was centralized or most prominent until it was destroyed in 70 AD. So here they are in that temple. Jesus comes in and starts to throw out of that temple those selling and buying in it. Not just the ones selling, the ones buying from them. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, birds for sacrifice or atonement. And he would not let anyone carry a utensil through the temple. Why would he do that? Because when you're carrying a utensil, where's your thought? If you're carrying a utensil through the temple, it's not part of your thought. If much of your thought is going to be on that utensil that you're carrying. When you're in the temple of Jehovah, there's one person about whom you should be thinking. Jehovah. That's how Jesus, that's his thought. What's going on here? Why are you carrying all that stuff? Why are you selling and buying and there's money with images of these humans on them in my Father's temple? And there's not supposed to be anything about these things clouding your thought. You're not supposed to be thinking about money and whether the bird is good enough to offer up. Everything is supposed to be thankfulness and dedication to Jehovah. There's no way you could have it with all that going on. And he knew that immediately, right? Where does he come from? There's none of that there. And there wasn't supposed to be in the first place. But here we are. But he kept teaching and saying, this is after all that was done, is it not written, my house? He's quoting the biblical text. He's quoting his Father. Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a cave of robbers. And notice verse 18, last text in this account. And the chief priests and scribes, the scholars, right, the most versed in the law, they heard it. And how did they respond? Oh, you're right. You know what? We were wrong. No. That's not that at all. And they began to seek how to destroy him, for they were in fear of him. Remember, I had a comment recently, I think it was by, I forget. Someone asked me why someone does something. They had an encounter with someone who's spiritually nuts. Based on all their activity, that you could conclude that. But they were obsessed in some negative way with me, and I told them, I said, they're just afraid, right? They hate what they fear the most, and right? It's not something special about me. It's just I'm teaching these texts like Jesus did, and probably not as good, but at least I'm trying to do the best I can. And if they didn't like him and the way he did it, well, they're certainly not going to like the attempts I'm making. So I see it like that. And here it is right here, isn't it? Right? They don't listen to anything if they're like these people. The chief people worshiping the biblical God. And the ones most versed, right? These are the ones you go to like Herod did to find out what's going on. Where's this happen? You know the text, right? And they don't know what they don't. They do and they don't. It's very important you remember that, right? Because you will see people who absolutely know the text, right? Here they are. Probably best of all, right? In ways that people today don't do at all. Not as much, right? Where they didn't have it as structured and separated, enumerated. Right? They knew the original languages, like the daily language. That's who they were. So it should not surprise you if we find others similar to that in terms of their knowledge of these texts, but also failing to do the most important things or to recognize the most important applications of these very same texts. Right? And then when they see things that fulfill these texts, like Jesus in the temple and him quoting Jehovah, they don't always expect them to recognize it and say, oh, you know what? And to have a change of heart. Maybe, right? We hope. don't be surprised that if they seek to destroy you like they did him. Why? They're afraid that you're right. They're afraid they're wrong. So it's only natural that they hate you for being what shows they're wrong. They could change, right? They could not be wrong. But they'd rather make you not right. Right? They'd rather go to the disciples of you rather than go to you and make other people not believe. And they go to the weaker ones. Or if they come to you, it's in ways that they should be able to see, right? Just like this. But then they go and they do this. Then they hate you even more. It's like the proverb says, right? Give knowledge to a wise person, they become wiser. Give knowledge to a stupid person, and they'll hate you. There are several proverbs to that effect. Let's take a look at another text. We're still in Mark 11. Let's take a look at several from verses 27 through 40. First, we'll read 27 through 33. All right, so let's take a look. 27 through 33. Okay. Looks like things are going all right. So, let's get back to the text. Mark 27. And they came again to Jerusalem. Talking about Jesus and his disciples, his students. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes, the scholars, the ones versed in the law, and the older men came to him. So here we have the chief religious leaders, the chief scholars, or the scholars, and the ones who've been around a long time in the group as part of this religion and community and thought, the way that they see them, with this group of individuals, representative of all these different types. Right? So there may be older ones as part of the group who may not be the chief priests or scribes, but they're still religious, they're still behind all of their religious thought and writings and the texts and the way that they see them and apply them. And so they come to him, Jesus, and they say to him, by what authority? Right? Remember earlier it said the crowds distinguished between the way Jesus talked and the way the scholars talked in terms of authority. Right? They all have the texts. There's just something different about it. And so here they come again. By what authority do you do these things? Why are you talking this way? Or who gave you this authority? Who sent you, right? Who's the one behind you? Verse 29, Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. You answer me, and I will also tell you by what authority I do these things, right? So normally when you answer a question with a question, it can seem evasive, right? But then again, they're really coming to him and asking a question that's designed to trap him or get him to say something in a way that they can use against him. And so he's not saying, I'm not going to answer your question. This is how he got him to respond. He says, I will answer your question. But first you tell me, right? You're the scribes and Pharisees. You're the older ones. I'm this one you're questioning. Right? I haven't reached that level where people like Herod see me the way people see you. So let me ask you a question, right? You're the scribes. You're the chief priests. You're the older men. Was the baptism by John from heaven or from men? Is it from God? Was John from God? Who's from God? Well, we're starting to see a little bit more, but was it John? Was John the Baptist from heaven or from men? Answer me, you scribes, you chief priests, you scholars of my father's law. What about John? Was he from God or from men? Verse 31, so they began to reason among themselves, the chief priests, scholars, and older men. So they're talking together, think of like a football huddle, right? Okay, guys, all right. If we say from heaven, he's going to say, well, then why didn't you listen to him? Why didn't you believe him? And we don't. We all know we didn't believe John, right? He hated us, and we hated him. So we can't tell him that. But at verse 32, if we dare say from men, well, because they're inferior, we're afraid of everybody, and they like John, right? They think he's a prophet. they'll freak out. Right? Then we'll lose our authority in a different way versus to him. So we can't do that. All right, so they're doing all these things, and Jesus in verse 33 replies and says, well, they in reply to Jesus said, after all that, we do not know. Right? They couldn't figure it out in terms of what would be best to not let him trap them. Right? Because they figure he wants them to say what? John is from heaven, right? And then he's going to tell them whether he's from heaven. But they don't want to answer him whether John's from heaven because they don't believe that. And they don't want to do it in front of the crowd because they don't want to lose their devotion. And many of them believe in John. And they're not being open about how they feel about John. Not to the extent they would hear or have to hear. So they say, we don't know. We're not going to answer your question. Right? The very thing that Jesus didn't do to them because they were asking a question to what? Trap him. So what does he do to them? The very same thing. And what do they not do? Answer him. So it provides the very basis for him not answering them when you're trying to trap them. In other words, he just did the same thing in order to not answer them. And they fell right into it. Now jump down to verse 11. I think if we go to, yes, chapter 12. All right, so let's just recap real quickly. So in verse 27 through 33 of chapter 11, you notice how the scribes and Pharisees and older men act, right? So they're not open with how they really feel because they're more concerned with giving approval to something that they don't believe in or getting disfavor from others. But what is Jesus really saying? And what are they avoiding answering? That John is from God, right? The very answer to the question we've been asking, who's from God? They're effectively answering by not answering. Right? At least Jesus, for sure. And the crowd. And they by their fear, of course, and their other concerns. But nevertheless, right? Was John somebody like the scholars, the scribes, the Pharisees, the older men, the people we're talking about, the ones Herod went to? Right? Was he viewed in that light? No. If you read the accounts, they came to him. He rejected them in strong terms. Right? He was considered kind of someone unusual. Right? He ate honey, insects, and wore somewhat wild clothes compared certainly to the scribes and Pharisees and the older men, others, the religious people we're talking about, and even Jesus comparatively to some extent probably in terms of how he was raised versus John and where he lived. At least to a certain point, John was viewed in that sense. So yet John was what? He had more authority than all of them, except for Jesus. Was John someone who was a part of any of those groups? No. He was seen as a nut job in some sense. And yet, he wasn't at all. He was directly from God. Even in a sense, very closely associated with the miracle birth of Jesus. So he's directly tied to these things. He's the one who paved the way. Malachi, the prophecy that was foretold about the one who would come before the Messiah. That's John. He's certainly from God in the biblical sense, right? And what did he do? Again, what did he eat? How did he dress? Who did he reject? The scribes, the chief priests, the older men, the others who were doing the things that Jesus also rejects, like buying, selling in the temple, even carrying things around in ways that distracted other people and themselves from the worship of his Father. And so they were way off, and they rejected those who were closer or who were right on. All right, let's take a look at Mark 12. And they avoided answering certain questions. And admittedly, so did Jesus, at least in this account. But they do it over and over again in ways where they're always trying to trap him. And he just trapped them with the same form and proved that they were hypocrites, or at least wouldn't be open about what they thought. Right? They just rejected John. He wouldn't admit it, though. But they would try to publicly get him to admit things that were wrong. Hypocrites. Mark 12, 38 through 40. And in his teaching, he went on to say, so this is Jesus. It says, in his teaching, after all these events and others that we didn't read, but we read a pretty good sample, right, to get a sense of the people he was encountering, right, the different primary priests to his father in a religious sense, according to the law, and those who were most versed in the law, the ones who knew the documents, the texts best, the ones who knew it the longest, the older men. In his teaching, he went on to say, look out for the scribes or scholars, the ones most versed when it comes to the law of my Father, the ones who know the laws and documents related to the God who is my Father that we worship, the ones who know those the best. Watch out for them. Verse 38, watch out for them. They want to walk around in special clothes, right, and robes, and they want greetings in the markets and front seats in the synagogues, most prominent places at the evening meals. They're the ones devouring the houses of widows, and for a pretext, make long prayers. And what does he say about all that stuff? Well, they're going to receive a heavier judgment. They're going to get it worse. They're going to get beat with more strokes when I come in the glory of my Father with all the angels. At least in a Christian sense, right? So he's saying to look out for the ones who are recognized, right? Not like John or him and the ones he's teaching, right there. He's learning from the best, right? And John was obviously sent as his forerunner. And he from God himself, right? But the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, older men that we're talking about, they knew the law, they knew the text, the best. Watch out for those. That's what he's talking about. Now let's take that into Luke. Let's read a couple texts from Luke. Luke 11:53. We're going to come back to a few of these accounts, but let's move forward into Luke. We may not come back to Mark, but we're going to go back to Matthew in a moment. But first, let's get into Luke. It's very important that we get a kind of a sense, a good chain of events related to Jesus and these different people, all of whom claim to be from God, whether it's John, whether it's Jesus, whether it's astrologers, right? Pretty much, at least from God in one sense, and the scribes and Pharisees and religious leaders, the scholars of the biblical text. All right, so let's just get that going a little more natural light here for as long as we can get it. But we're making pretty good progress. So, Luke chapter 11. All right, went a little too far there. Luke 11:53 through 12:1. So, when he went out from there, the scribes and the Pharisees started in to press upon him terribly and to ply him with questions about further things. It says they were really bothering him with questions, lying in wait for him to catch something out of his mouth. These are the Pharisees, the scribes, the scholars, the people who were worshiping Jehovah, his Father of the Christ. And this is what they're doing. Right? In the meantime, when the crowd had gathered together in so many thousands that they were stepping upon one another, right? This is a scene of a lot of people. He started out by saying first to his students, number one, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Right? We've already kind of seen that, right? They're the ones who are representing Jehovah. They're in his temple. Right? They're recognized by people like Herod and others as the best, the most versed in the law. The ones related to the sacrifices and the priestly arrangement. He says to watch out for them. They're hypocrites. But they know it and they act it the best. Have we ever seen that? Even if you're not a Christian or a Jew, have you ever seen that in whatever it is that you do? Let's take a look at John now. Great message of John, chapter 7. All right, we're getting close to our subject text, which I didn't identify in the thumbnail, but it's really what we're talking about, right? Being from God. Who's from God? Was John from God? Was Jesus from God? Was Moses from God? The prophets? Well, most of us have answered these questions by looking at history and the text and archaeology and science in ways that make sense, right? But when we read these accounts, what's standing out? We believe these things happen, but what are these people doing? Why are they viewed in one way or another when they all claim to be from God? John chapter 7, verses 14 through 16. When by now the festival was half over, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. Therefore, the Jews fell to wondering, how does this man, right, he's in the temple now teaching. This is John's account, so it's not necessarily directly in line time-wise with every other event we've done. Some of them reset in the account, or earlier than what we read in the prior account. But at this point in the account of John, Jesus is in the temple teaching, and the Jews are there wondering, how does this man have a knowledge of letters when he has not studied at the schools? Now, that part, not studied at the schools, it really just means has not learned. It's the best way to really see the meaning of that text, which implies in this context, the way the Jews are asking the question about letters, right? And then the system related to the temple and comparing it to what Jesus is doing, and he doesn't have the same education they do. It is at their schools. So it's just more explanatory in that sense. Jesus in turn answered them and said, what I teach is not mine, but belongs to him that sent me. Okay, that's how. That's how he knows what they're learning. They just don't agree with him, even though they're both learning from whom? The same one. Right? Is not the knowledge of the letters that they get through their schools the exact same knowledge that Jesus got from his Father? Or that Jesus himself, if you believe he's the angel of Jehovah or Michael the archangel, and was with Moses and taught him all these things, including the law? Well, they would both know the same things, right? Yet they're questioning him. Right? It's interesting, right? They would see that he knows the information. Wouldn't that be enough? No, it's not enough. It's not enough for people who are not like him. They want to know, why aren't you like them? Why are you so much like him when he hasn't studied the way we've studied? Well, because we want to be like him. Not really like you. Not unless you're like him in the ways that we want to. Let's take a look at John 8. I consider this our subject text because it really involves our key phrase, even though other texts do as well. But let's take a look at it, and then we'll go back through just a few more texts, and then we'll wrap things up. John 8, 47. Subject text here. Let's take a look at things. Looks good. All right. Subject text, I think, in one way. It's still Jesus. Account Jesus. He's talking with the different Jews who are questioning him in different ways. So in verse 47, Jesus says, he that is from God listens to the sayings of God. This is why you do not listen. Because you, the ones he's talking to, are not from God. And I want you to remember that. I want you to remember that text, or that part, even if it's not by numbers. He that is from God, or she that is from God, whoever is from God, would have to what? Be listening to the sayings of God. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, right? I mean, a part of listening to God is our repentance, and even in their case, right? They had a whole system involved with repentance. They just were controlling it and misusing it in ways that led to people being depressed, right? Thrown about as sheep without a shepherd, even though they were supposed to be the shepherds. But that's how he came. And that's why they saw him the way they did. They recognized that quality in his voice, quality of authority, And that's why Jesus says to all that recognize him, recognize his voice. We know that quality of authority. It's not because of how we studied at a school governed by people who were like this. Right? We may have used those tools. Certainly Paul did. Right? It helped him in many ways. But Jesus didn't. Many of the disciples didn't. They didn't need to. Right? Whether they did or they didn't, do they listen? Right? The scribes, the scholars, they knew it better than Jesus' disciples, for sure, and than most people. It didn't make a difference. It didn't make them better. It made them worse, right? If your righteousness doesn't what? If it's not more than the ones who represent to most people the best of the best, it's not enough. Well, then obviously they're not the best of the best, because you can't get better than the best of the best. They're just not who they think they are. But they act like that's who they think they are. Excuse me, it's not. And their actions show that. Not their mistakes, not the times where they do things wrong and then recover and then try to make amends either under the Mosaic system or in our case through forgiveness. That's all a part of recognizing who we are, right? We're not self-righteous to the point to where we ignore the mistakes we make. We try to move on and get better. And we look for others to do the same when they also make mistakes. And in that way, we're serving each other, regardless of our mistakes. But when people aren't making mistakes, when they are intentionally rejecting something they claim to believe, right? They claim to believe in his Father and the things that are foretold in connection with the Son. Well, then what are they doing with Herod? Right? What are they doing in the Sanhedrin talking about people like Jesus in ways where they have to come up with charges that relate to him being seditious to Caesar in order to have him executed? When in fact he was fulfilling the very things that they were believing in their reading and teaching of these texts, right? They disagreed with him. Fine, we get it. They're making that choice. They're deciding not to believe him. At that point, they're not listening to the one they say they're from. And this is why I want you to remember this text, because it's how you'll know next who is from God. Right? Maybe not at a certain moment where people are wrong, but when they're right, are they listening to God? Well, then they're from God in that sense, right? They're doing the things that they learn from God, either in a direct sense, right? The spirit we have from God, the conscience, law in our hearts, or through these texts, or texts like them that are consistent with them. And they're following them, right? They're doing their best to show they really believe in them. They believe the texts are the best. Not that they're the best or that their group is the best or that the people in their group are the best. The texts are the best. Right? John the Baptist was better than all of them, was he not? Except for the Christ, before the apostles and the ones who Jesus taught. Yet he was seen as by the ones who were considered the best officially, in terms of the structure of the Jewish community, as one of the worst, if not a nut job. So do you see how far removed it can be? And why we need to see certain things so that we're not deceived when we see other things that might make us think, okay, this person looks like they might be from God. Well, they certainly know the law, they know the text, probably better than them all. But what are they doing with that knowledge? How are they applying it? Not in a mistake or a sense where we like see him do something wrong, but are they really living a consistent life? One that tries to glorify Jehovah, tries to follow the pattern of his Son, and treat others the way they want to be treated, right? Not perfectly, but you're doing your best. And that's what we should expect from people, that they're doing their best. And where they're not, we help them. We don't pile on, right? Dog pile. Someone just made a mistake, everybody, boom. Let's go get them. Right? If we're like that, we're done. Right? We are done. If we get like that at all, it's a wrap. And I won't let it happen, right? That's not who we are. That's not treating others the way we want to be treated. So whether I'm here or not, right, that has to be consistent. And if you are mistreating someone who makes mistakes in our religion or any religion, then I don't see how you could really. You're just like the scribes and Pharisees, are you not? You're certainly not doing your best to show love to people who are doing their best, right? Regardless of our mistakes, we're all different. People struggle with different things. But what does Jesus say, right? Do they come back and say, I'm changing my ways, I'm going to do a better job? Is it something we should even be concerned about? Well, we're not really supposed to be involved in people's lives where we're there trying to, like the Pharisees and scribes were, find out if they're washing their hands properly. Right? We make issues about everything, as well as about the Christ. Right? They're arguing about all that stuff, rather than doing the things that would show, like John was doing and those who came to him were doing, repentance. Right? They're sorry. They want a relationship with Yahweh, and the law is not enough. Something's got to be more. Here comes the Messiah, right on time. Only they weren't ready. He that is from God listens to the sayings of God. That is why you don't listen. Right? Not you who make mistakes or are trying to do better, but you who are directly against me. You're directly saying that the teaching of the text, which is the text, not traditions we've added to it, are not from God. Well, the one way we can tell is by whether or not we're listening to the sayings of God. So our sayings are simple. One God the Father, the Son, the Messiah, Jesus, and treating each other the way we want to be treated. That's really the main things that if you listen to, we accept and will work with you as someone who is from God. And you don't have to be perfect. In fact, if you were, be a concern more like the scribes and Pharisees, right? Because that's how they wanted to be. What did they say to Jesus? We're not blind also, are we? And what does Jesus say to them? You say you see, so your sin remains, right? And this is in John 9, I believe, right after he heals the blind man. And then they come to the blind man. And then there's a discussion about spiritual and literal blindness. And at some point, he encounters them, and they ask him that question. Right? So they don't believe they need forgiveness. Right? What was it that they said to Jesus' disciples when they caught him in the house? Eating with sinners? It said that. Eating with sinners and tax collectors. Not those most versed in the law. They didn't like that. They went to the students. Why is he? Do you see what he's doing? The ones who are sick need a physician, not the ones who are healthy. Right? You say you see. You're healthy. Well, why would I be with you? Right? Maybe at times here or there, right? Because he did go into some of the scribes or Pharisees' house and Nicodemus and others. But what's the problem with him being with the ones who need him the most, right? Even a doctor has time with other people who are not sick. But what does he do for a living? So we shouldn't criticize him if he's in there with sick people. That's what the scribes and the Pharisees do. All right, let's go back to a few accounts. Matthew chapter 15. We're going to wrap this up in about 20, 30 minutes. Matthew 15. Let's take a look at a couple more accounts. This is important stuff because we're constantly confronted, whether it's with people in the text or people in the world or in other writings of history. Is this from God? Right? Who's from God and how can we tell? Well, he that is from God listens to the saying of God. That I can tell. And I can tell you that according to any religion. So here we're talking about Judeo-Christian. But even if you believe in a God of another religion, you want to know if the person who's part of your religion is from that God? I have the answer. If that person listens to that God, they're from that God. Just like in the Christian religion. So you should be able to benefit from our discussion. And certainly if you're a Christian. Because hopefully you'll remember these things so that we can keep practicing our religion. Doing it, showing it, right? The things that those who claim they're the most, the best of the best don't. They want the attention. They want the place. They want the prominence. They don't like it when other people get that kind of thing. Matthew chapter 15, verses 12 through 14. Just a couple of them. And we'll take a look at a couple more accounts and wrap it up. Matthew 12. Then the disciples came up and said to him, do you know? Okay, so his students are talking to him. They're going to Jesus. Do you know that the Pharisees stumbled or were really bothered by hearing what you said. And again, we're not going to get into everything, but he talks about, how the Pharisees, they teach the commands of men over the biblical text. And so they question him and his disciples about some of those traditions versus giving the priority to the biblical text and not worrying about those other things, the extra stuff, the extra cleaning. So as part of that discussion, the disciples come to him and they're kind of like, the Pharisees, they freaked out, And so in verse 13, in reply, he said, that's Jesus talking to the disciples, every plant that my heavenly Father did not plant will be uprooted. This is consistent with other texts like John 6 that we read about before, where you can come to the Father will draw people, and you can learn, and you will be given the opportunity even to grow, right? What does it say? Every plant will be uprooted. So there can be a period where people, like the Pharisees, grow and appear to be like religious trees, right? Like the things that one of the blind people saw before Jesus healed them completely. A different blind man. He thought he was seeing trees. But in a religious sense, right? Scribes and Pharisees and others who were supposed to be strong like a tree, right? Not easily bent or broken. Well, they can become that for a while, but they can be uprooted. And so if anyone stumbles after growing in response to Jehovah and the Son, that's Jah's will. He's the one who decides ultimately with the Son whether we continue to grow in this religion, in this faith in Him. So we shouldn't worry too much about it, is the point of this text, right? The ones whom we think should know the most, the ones we might think, gosh, these people know, right? They know the Bible. They taught me. I learned from them at times, and now I see and they don't, and I want to help them. No. You're right that they see, and you're right that you want to help them, but you can't always help them grow. The Father does, right? We water, we plant. What is Paul? What is Apollos? Nothing. We just do these things that we're supposed to do. It's up to Jehovah. He's not going to lose any, except those like the son of destruction, right? The ones who are meant to come and to grow will. And if they don't grow or come to you at the time that you think they should, it's not your will that really matters. It's important that you continue to do the will that matters and to be aware of those who are also doing the things from God that show they're from God, right? But otherwise, we have to let people grow or be uprooted. And then verse 14, he goes on to say, why? Let them be. Blind guides is what they are. If then a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into the pit. These are the ones they were supposed to and were probably looking to the most before Jesus. The ones, the chief priests, the scholars, who knew that's not an ignorance issue. There was something else wrong. There were other reasons why they were this knowledgeable, why they knew the Father this well, and why people in other religions, non-Judeo-Christian religions, or in other views or schools of thought that just have a primary thing or figure, can have similar types of people, right? Because that's just who they are. That proves it, right? It's not a product specifically of this religion. It's just who people are. We're sometimes different plants, right? You can't get figs from a grape tree, right? You're not going to get thorns from figs. Each tree produces its own fruit, and that's how you know what kind of tree it is. All right, let's take a look at another text in Matthew 16 this time. Let's look at more of the teaching of the Pharisees. Why is Jesus so concerned about them? They know his Father the best, supposedly. They know the text the best, probably, in most cases. Matthew 16, this teaching, he called the leaven of them, their hypocrisy, which we've seen, and the way they viewed him and the way they viewed themselves and other people. And these texts all follow and worship the same thing, right? We're different. So we should see something similar today. it shouldn't surprise us if it's not different. Matthew 16, 6 through 12. Jesus said to them, "Keep your eyes open and watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." So they, the disciples, began to reason among themselves, saying, "We did not take any loaves of bread along." Knowing this, Jesus said, "Why are you doing this reasoning among yourselves? Because you have no loaves, you with little faith. Did you not yet see the point, or did you not remember the 5 loaves in the case of the 5,000? And how many baskets you took up?" He's referring to a prior miracle that he had done. "Or the 7 loaves in the case of the 4,000? And how many provision baskets you took up?" So he's saying, okay, I spoke of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and I told you to watch out. And now you're talking about real bread, right? The type of real bread that I did a miracle this time and this time. Okay. How is it you did not discern I didn't talk to you about loaves? I wasn't talking about real bread. But watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they grasped that he said to watch out, not for the leaven of the loaves of bread, but for the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The teaching, the things they're teaching, right? The excessive teachings that go beyond the text. In this case, having to do with things like cleaning and things that Jesus and his disciples did on certain days that they viewed incorrectly because they didn't understand the text or the one who inspired it. So Jesus is telling them, you got to watch out for them. They know the text best. They're the ones at this time taking care of all these temple things that I can't stand, right? I just threw them out. I just openly condemn them for doing things that distract from the worship of my Father, the God of all things, the one whom we as a people uniquely represent in our ways. They're doing all this stuff right there in the temple. Watch out for them. They know him best in that way, but they don't know him at all. They don't even know me. And I came in that one's name. Luke 16. We're about to wrap it up here. A few more texts. Trying to ask the question and answer it from the text that we accept as Judeo-Christians, but that's applicable in other religions or those who don't worship God at all, but who have a similar system with different people, but similar types to what we see in our religion involving Jesus Christ. And different people who had the same religious views, were part of the same religion, but were clearly not really from God. Even though many people would have sworn, even though not to swear in the wrong way, but the religious people of this day, based on the way that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scholars, the chief priests acted and ran these things, taught the law, that they were the closest to Yahuwah. And what we've seen and shown is that's not the case. And if that's not the case according to these texts in these ways, how can we learn from that today? Are the same people existing? And can we see the same things in ourselves are developing before it's too late? Luke 16, 13 through 15. No house servant, this is Jesus talking, no house servant can be a slave to 2 masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will stick to the one and despise the other. You cannot be slaves to God and to riches. Okay, so how does slaving to God or for riches relate to the type of question, who is from God, and the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees religion? Because in verse 14, notice what they are. They're lovers of money. Right? What were they doing in the temple of his father's worship? They were selling and buying. They were showing love for money. More than Yahuwah. Or even at all in his presence. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all of these things, and they began to sneer at him. Consequently, he said to them, you are those who declare yourselves righteous before men. Right? Remember what he said, the way they talk, the way they dress, the way they act, the way they are. But God knows your hearts, the things that most people can't see. Because what is a lofty thing among men is a disgusting thing in God's sight. Just like in the temple, the things they were doing, the kind of people they're showing they are. They're loving the money. We know it, we need it, we use it. We don't love it. We love Jehovah. But they had brought that love for money all the way into the temple. And it affected them to the extent that he describes them the way he does here. Luke 19. 2 more texts. Excuse me. And then I'll talk about what's next in our video series. Luke 19:45. And he entered into the temple, and he started to throw out those who were selling. We've read this before, but I'm going to read it again because of its importance. I brought it up several times since then. This is Luke's account. He entered the temple and started to throw out those who were selling. And in the other account we read, said selling and buying. Right? Anyone who was distracted from thought about his Father in that temple. Luke 19:45, he entered the temple. We read that, started to throw out those who were selling, saying to them, it is written, and my house will be a house of prayer. But you made it a cave of robbers. Right? That's an example of someone who's from God. He's quoting the text. He's acting in harmony with the text. He cannot tolerate the kind of disgusting activity that's taking place in ways that I think you will see regardless of what religion you look in or what type of group you may be a part of. If there are different people who are similar to those we've read about, you will find that those who are not true to the primary example very often are in it for the money. That's a big deal, if not one of the primary or the primary motivation for those who often appear to be most like those you would think best represent the thing you all love and worship together. But that's not always the case. It was not the case here. And so, as hard as it may be, right, it wasn't easy for these people. They were in there buying and selling, right? The Pharisees are doing it. Sadducees are doing it. All the scholars are here. What could be wrong? I'll tell you what could be wrong. Excuse me. Got a little dry there. It's against the text. And if you claim to follow the text's God, then you better do what the text says and not what it says not to do. Excuse me. If you're going to do things like create a place of worship for Jehovah, if it says his house is a house of prayer, not a cave of robbers, robbers being people who are obsessed with wealth, right? Even if it's not theirs, and most of the time it's not. And what are they doing in the temple? They're taking the wealth from other people, giving them things to give to Jehovah, right? Well, the text was pretty clear. And that's why Jesus quoted it out loud. That's why he took this radical action. It's not normal. It's not something he did every day. Doesn't seem like it. But he knew the right time. He knew the right place. And he knew the people who were doing the wrong things when they were supposed to be right. And that's where the difficulty often lies, does it not? Who is from God? Sometimes it's not always clear, like with the astrologers we talked about. They certainly were coming to honor Jesus Christ in the biblical account. But in the fullest extent in which we see people as coming from God, according to the biblical account, they don't quite qualify. But maybe in some unrelated sense, or related sense in the ultimate purpose of Jehovah. And we can't speak for all these things, nor should we. What we should speak for are the things that we say we believe in. I say I believe in these things. I say I believe in that God. And part of that belief involves me at times making mistakes, but overall, you're going to see me following that God and teaching the things he says. Even no matter what. It has nothing to do with being right. We're not supposed to always be right. the ones who claim to always be right or who act like it are usually wrong, at least according to these texts. Let's take a look at our last account. John chapter 12. Now, just because, when we read these accounts, obviously, certain things stand out, do they not? And it's sort of like, okay, that's pretty obvious, and yet they're not. Well, we've read descriptions about people liking the most prominent places. Well, it's not always easy to not take the most prominent place, right? Sometimes it's wrong, though. Maybe we need to take a closer look at how we're representing God when we're trying to. Even if we feel it's okay, maybe there are things we can do to not fall quite in line with certain things that other people do that clearly are wrong, at least according to these texts, and maybe similar times when we're involved with others who do similar things, right? Where people have the option of choosing different places to sit or wearing certain clothes or speaking in certain ways, right? Really long prayers for a pretext. I've been in places like that where I've thought certain things about those types of people doing certain things. And at times I've even moderated myself, right? I'm talking too long. Maybe I won't wear that, right? It'll have the wrong, communicate the wrong thing. Do I always get it right? Probably not. But I think about it. And so that's what we should do. Right? We should be aware of whether or not we're acting in ways that are consistent with these texts that show that we are from God. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect. What it should be is from that God. Whether you're Judeo-Christian or something else. Right? What did the astrologers do? Whatever it was motivating them, they did it. Right? Even when it involved some other God. So at least they're an example in that respect. But let's take a look at this text and whether people like the Pharisees and scribes and others are an example in a way we should look to as well, right? I mean, they knew the law. Is there anything we can learn from them? Well, I mean, certainly we can say that there were times when they must have acted in ways that would have been seen as good, right? I mean, nice to people in ways that at least socially were acceptable. But the way they're portrayed in these texts in comparison to Jesus or people like John are totally different. And yet they're all worshiping the same God. They're all using the same texts. There's really no dispute about the language or the translation. So why is there such a difference? And I'm going to suggest, and I have been arguing, that it's because of the people involved, right? Every plant not planted by my Father will be uprooted. All right, it may grow. It may become a plant. But it's Yahuwah who says whether it will grow or no. And so there can be people who absolutely seem like they follow the same God or in the same religion and yet be totally different. And it's important for us to recognize that so we're not misled. And so hopefully we can keep others from being misled, or at least helping them see the differences, right? Like we are. Like where there are examples in the very religion we believe in of people who claim to follow it but who do things wrong. And so there's definitely an example. There's definitely a difference. There are certainly descriptions we are given that if you see in other people in religions, you should watch out for. You should not ignore. Not if it happens once or twice, right? We're really here to help people who are like that. But the ones who are like the best of the best, right? They think they're the best. They're the ones who are recognized by others who don't even like the religion as the ones you go to when you have a question. At least they were in this case. John chapter 12, verse 43. So more about people who are like that in this religion. What is it about them that we can look at and see, okay, right, there may be a part of our religion. They may believe in the same things. They may even be among the most knowledgeable of the same things that I believe in. But what's different? Why are they not the same? Why don't they have the same authority as the people that I can see in a different way? John chapter 12, verse 42 and verse 43. This is Jesus involved with people like those we've been talking about, right? People who appear to be close to his Father, very knowledgeable about the law and the prophets, and yet they're completely against it, at least if you see it the way he does. And so he quotes people like Isaiah, and then he says in verse 43 or 42 and then 43, all the same. Many, even after, what it means by all the same is, after the Jews and Jesus had this discussion where he quoted from the book of Isaiah and said, you're not the same type of person that I am when it comes to worshiping my Father. After he does that, all the same, even after he did that, many of the rulers put faith in him. Right? Even after he basically said, look, the Isaiah was talking about you and said, you guys you've hardened your hearts, you're not listening, and yet you act like you're the ones closest to the best religion. So after he had this rough encounter with them, some of the rulers actually put faith in him. But because of the Pharisees, they would not confess him, right? They wouldn't be open and honest with what they thought. Well, who did they learn that from? The Pharisees, right? Was it not the Pharisees who, when they went to Jesus and he questioned them about John, what was it that they didn't do? They didn't answer his question, right? Because they didn't want to be looked down upon by the people for not believing in John. Well, what's happening here? The rulers who are with those similar type of people who wouldn't express faith in John because of the crowd of people, now these rulers are caught because they're afraid of the Pharisees. So they have all these people afraid of each other. Why? Because they're looking at the external factors. They're looking at the schools they went to. They're looking at the groups they're a part of. They're looking at the external clothes and biblical text that they use and feature versus the things that were common of people like John. Right? So it was so bad that even though they believed in Jesus, it says right here, they still believed in him even after he contended with the false religious leaders and scholars. The rulers are like, okay, looks like he won that. He's right. He may have a point. He may be the Messiah. But I can't say anything because the people that he just showed were wrong might not like me. That's how influential they are. It's not so simple, is it? I mean, it's one thing for us, to read these texts and do these things and show how simple the differences are, right? I mean, it's not that hard to pull up some of the accounts involving Jesus and others who claim that they are from God and then say, okay, well, here are the characteristics that mark the people that I can see are from God, people like Jesus. And here are the characteristics that the ones who are acting, completely different from their own religion in its purest thought, right? They're adding all these traditions, other things that came about later. They're putting on the same level as the texts that we all accept as the best. Okay, so we can see those things. We can line up those things. But that's about all, right? I mean, we can do our best to show that we're following those things, that we're from God in that sense, right? We're doing our best. When we make mistakes, we confess. And we try to do things better, right? Help others do the same. That's the best we can do. But we can also watch out for others who claim to be the best at what they do. Because that's not really what it's about, is it? Is being the best, right? The one who knows the most versed in the law of Jehovah, what made the people in the accounts we reviewed today seem like they were from God? No. Certainly the ones we saw were from God, knew the texts, right? They weren't dumb. Far from it. But there was a way, an extent in which other people of Jesus' day viewed themselves in that same religion much differently than others. So much so that others in that same religion agreed that they were different. And even when they believed in people like Jesus, over and against those very same people in discussion about that religion, they were so affected by the people who were wrong that they couldn't openly confess who was right.